12 bombers vanished into the blue, leaving behind only a crackle of static and a mystery that has haunted the Pacific for 80 years. They weren't taken down by Zeros or flak, they simply stepped off the edge of the map and into a void. In late 1941, the Pacific was a vast, silent chessboard, and the United States was moving its most powerful pieces into position. The Gibraltar of the Pacific, Oahu, Hawaii, was being reinforced with the crown jewel of American air power, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. To the High Command in Washington, the B-17 was more than an airplane, it was a deterrent. They believed that a sufficient force of these four-engine giants at Hickam Field would make any Japanese carrier commander think twice before approaching the Hawaiian Islands. The mission was designated as a routine ferry flight, but in 1941, there was nothing routine about flying 2,400 miles over an unbroken expanse of salt water. The Ghost Squadron, a flight of 12 B-17s, gathered at Hamilton Field, California. The crews were young, many of them fresh out of flight school, buzzing with the excitement of a tropical posting. They saw Hawaii as a paradise of surf and sunshine, unaware that they were flying directly into the opening notes of a world war. The logistics of the transfer were a nightmare of weight and balance. To make the jump from the California coast to Oahu, the bombers had to be stripped of almost everything. Armor plating was removed. Oxygen tanks were minimized. Most critically, the defensive machine guns were taken out to save weight, leaving the aircraft as hollowed-out shells. In their place, massive auxiliary fuel tanks were bolted into the bomb bays, huge shaker tanks that hummed with thousands of gallons of high-octane volatile gasoline. These planes were no longer fortresses, they were flying fuel cans. On the night of December 6th, the 12 aircraft throttled up, their Wright Cyclone engines spitting blue flame into the California dark. They took off in 2 waves, 6 aircraft in each, spaced out to navigate by the stars. The flight plan was simple. Fly west-southwest, hit the point of no return roughly halfway, and pick up the radio beacon from Honolulu for the final approach. The pilots settled into the long, rhythmic drone of the cruise. Below them, the Pacific was a black void, indistinguishable from the sky except for the occasional reflection of the moon on a whitecap. The navigators worked feverishly with sextants and drift meters, fighting the invisible trade winds that could blow a plane miles off course without the pilot ever noticing. They were a bridge of silver aluminum stretching across the largest ocean on Earth. But as the sun began to crest the horizon on the morning of December 7th, the Ghost Squadron found themselves trapped between 2 disasters: a fuel gauge hitting empty and a destination that was currently being erased from the map. In the pre-dawn hours of December 7th, the only thing connecting 12 heavy bombers to the rest of humanity was a thin, flickering needle on a radio compass. They weren't flying toward a destination, they were chasing a signal. As the Ghost Squadron crossed the point of no return, that invisible, terrifying line in the Pacific where a pilot no longer has enough fuel to turn back to California, the cockpit crews began searching for the KGMB radio signal. In 1941, navigation over the open ocean was an imprecise art. To guide the bombers in, the Army had arranged for a local Honolulu radio station to play Hawaiian music all night, providing a continuous homing beacon for the B-17's radio direction finders. 4 hours, the pilots sat in the dark, listening to the upbeat, tinny strumming of ukuleles cutting through the atmospheric crackle. It was a surreal soundtrack to a flight that was about to turn into a nightmare. Around 7:30 a.m., the lead B-17, piloted by Major Truman Landon, made a routine radio check-in with the Hickam Field Tower. The exchange was calm, almost mundane. Landon reported their position, a few hundred miles out, and requested a weather update for landing. The tower controller's voice was steady, confirming the clear skies over Oahu. There was no hint of panic, no mention of the massive Japanese strike force that was, at that very second, cresting the mountains of the North Shore. It was the last normal conversation the Ghost Squadron would ever have. Moments later, the airwaves shattered. The cheerful Hawaiian music on KGMB was abruptly cut off by a frantic, high-pitched voice screaming about an air attack. Then, the Hickam Tower went silent. Landon keyed his mic again, asking for clarification, but all he received was a wall of white noise and the haunting rhythmic thump-thump of distant explosions being picked up by open microphones on the ground. The B-17s were flying into a blind void. The static silence, that followed was perhaps the most terrifying part of the flight. The pilots began calling out to one another over the interplane frequency. "Did you hear that? Where is the beacon?" One by one, the 12 aircraft began to deviate. Without the radio beacon to tether them, and with the horizon obscured by the rising pillar of black smoke from the burning fleet at Pearl Harbor, the trade winds began to push them apart. Some pilots claimed they saw strange aircraft appearing through the clouds, sleek, nimble fighters with red circles on their wings. Because the B-17s were unarmed, they couldn't fight back, they could only dive for the cloud cover. In the chaos of the jammed frequencies and the sight of their destination in flames, the Ghost Squadron broke formation. They scattered like autumn leaves in a hurricane. Some attempted to land on short, civilian airstrips, others headed for the open sea, hoping to find a clear patch of water. But for several of those 12 B-17s, the last radio contact wasn't a cry for help. It was a simple, unfinished sentence that trailed off into a hiss of salt air static, leaving behind a question that wouldn't be answered for 80 years. Searching for a needle in a haystack is hard, but searching for a silver needle in a blue abyss while the world is on fire is impossible. The Pacific doesn't just take planes. It hides them under 4 miles of crushing silence. In the chaotic aftermath of December 7th, the U.S. Navy was a wounded giant. While the smoke still billowed from the battleship Roe wreckage, a desperate secondary mission began: find the missing B-17s. Of the 12 bombers that had departed California, several had made miraculous, harrowing landings on golf courses and short fighter strips around Oahu. But as the sun set on the first day of the war, the tally didn't add up. 4 aircraft were missing. 4 crews, 40 men, had simply vanished into the Pacific. The Navy's search patterns were dictated by dead reckoning and desperation. Because the B-17s had been forced to break formation to avoid Japanese Zeros, no one knew exactly where they had gone down. Destroyers and PBY Catalina flying boats were dispatched to the north and west of the islands, scouring the whitecaps for a glimpse of a yellow life raft or a shimmering oil slick. But the Pacific is a master of deception. A B-17, for all its size, is a speck of dust on a sapphire sheet. The search was plagued by phantom sightings. Jittery lookouts on destroyers reported seeing signal flares that turned out to be low-hanging stars. Pilots reported seeing debris fields that were actually floating kelp beds. Every hour that passed, the search grid expanded exponentially. The math of a search pattern is brutal. If a plane is off course by just 1 degree over 1,000 miles, the search area becomes thousands of square miles of empty water. Compounding the failure was the sheer state of panic. The Navy was terrified of a follow-up Japanese attack. Every time a search plane spotted something on the horizon, it had to weigh the risk. Was it a downed American crew, or a Japanese picket boat waiting to strike? The fruitless hunt was further hindered by the B-17's design. While the Flying Fortress was legendary for taking battle damage, it was notoriously poor at ditching in the water. Its massive, low-slung ball turret, though removed for this flight, the housing remained, acted like a scoop, often causing the plane to flip or break its back upon hitting the swells. After 72 hours, the search was quietly scaled back. The Navy needed every available hull to defend the remaining fleet. The families of the missing crews received the standard, gut-wrenching telegram: missing in action. No wreckage was found. No bodies recovered. The 4 B-17s of the Ghost Squadron had become part of the deep. They weren't just lost, they were erased by an ocean that had no interest in the wars of men. For the next 80 years, the only search patterns would be those of conspiracy theorists and grieving families, wondering if their loved ones had run out of fuel or if they were still flying, somewhere in the static. When the fuel runs out and the radio goes dead, the imagination takes over. Did they drop into the abyss because of a math error, or were they the first secret casualties of a hunter they never saw coming? For decades, the disappearance of the 4 B-17s from the Ghost Squadron has been a magnet for aviation theorists. Without wreckage, the vacuum of information was filled with 3 distinct possibilities, each more haunting than the last. The first, and most pragmatic, was the navigation nightmare. In 1941, aerial navigation was a battle against the elements. The B-17s were flying blind once the Honolulu beacon was cut. A slight shift in the upper-level trade winds, unseen and unfelt by the pilots, could have pushed the heavy bombers 50 miles off course in an hour. Over a 2,400-mile flight, a 2-degree error isn't a mistake. It's a death sentence. Many believe the missing planes simply bypassed Oahu entirely, flying into the vast, empty blue hole of the Central Pacific until their engines coughed on the last fumes of vapor. The second theory involves the invisible wall of the Pacific weather. While the skies over Pearl Harbor were clear, the flight path from California often crossed microfronts, localized, violent squalls that didn't appear on the primitive weather charts of the era. A.B. 17 stripped of its armor and carrying massive, unstable fuel tanks in the bomb bay was a fragile bird. If a pilot, exhausted after 12 hours at the yoke, flew into a severe downdraft or a lightning-heavy cell, the structural stress could have snapped a wing or caused a catastrophic fuel leak. In the pitch black of a Pacific storm, a plane doesn't crash, it vanishes. The most chilling theory, however, is interception. We know that on the morning of December 7th, the skies around Hawaii were swarming with Japanese A-6M-0s. These fighters were looking for targets, and a flight of slow, unarmed silver B-17s would have looked like a gift from heaven. There are unconfirmed reports from Japanese carrier pilots of large 4-engine flying boats being sighted and engaged far out at sea, away from the main attack. If a Zero caught a lone, defenseless B-17, the encounter would have been short and brutal. A single burst of 20mm cannon fire into those exposed Shaker fuel tanks would have turned the flying fortress into a localized sun. These theories have sparked endless debate. Was it a mechanical failure of the improvised fuel system? Did the pilots, seeing the smoke of Pearl Harbor, turn away in a desperate attempt to find an alternate island, only to find nothing but waves? The Ghost Squadron remains a riddle because each theory is equally plausible. Whether it was the wind, the waves, or the enemy, the result was the same. 4 crews were erased from the sky, leaving behind a mystery that would remain top secret for the duration of the war. 12 heavy bombers were the only hope for a dying base, but by sunset, 4 had become ghosts in the machine. The military didn't just lose these planes, they tried to delete the memory of their failure from a nation on the brink. In the dark weeks following the Pearl Harbor attack, the American public was drowning in a sea of bad news. The Pacific Fleet was at the bottom of the harbor, the Philippines were falling, and Wake Island was under siege. The Roosevelt administration faced a terrifying crisis of confidence. In this fragile atmosphere, the story of the Ghost Squadron, the 12 B-17s that flew into the teeth of the raid, was a double-edged sword. While the courage of the pilots who landed under fire was celebrated, the fate of the 4 missing aircraft was quietly scrubbed from the official narrative. The U.S. War Department realized that admitting 4 of the nation's most advanced superweapons had simply vanished due to navigation errors or fuel exhaustion would be a devastating blow to morale. It suggested that the B-17, the supposed flying fortress, was fragile and that the vast Pacific was an unconquerable enemy. To prevent a panic, the military initiated what many historians now call a strategic silence. The missing crews were listed as missing in action in small-town newspapers, but the larger story of their mid-Pacific disappearance was kept under the strictest top-secret classification. This cover-up wasn't just about morale, it was about tactical secrecy. The military didn't want the Japanese to know exactly how vulnerable the B-17 ferry route from California really was. If the Imperial Japanese Navy realized that American bombers were arriving unarmed and low on fuel, they could have stationed picket ships or submarines along the route to pick them off like sitting ducks. By keeping the disappearances quiet, the Army Air Corps was able to continue reinforcing Hawaii without the public, or the enemy, realizing the true cost of the journey. For the families of the Ghost Squadron, the cover-up was a secondary tragedy. They were given no details, no wreckage, and no closure. In some cases, files were intentionally mislabeled or lost in the bureaucratic chaos of the early war years. It wasn't until decades later, when declassified documents began to surface, that the true scope of the December 7th B-17 flight became clear. The Ghost Squadron wasn't just lost to the ocean, it was buried under the weight of a national necessity to appear invincible at a time when America was at its most vulnerable. 80 years of salt and silence have a way of swallowing the truth, but modern technology is finally peeling back the layers of the Pacific floor. We used to think they were gone forever. Now, the shadows on our sonar are starting to scream. For the better part of a century, the 4 missing B-17s of the Ghost Squadron existed only as ink on fading casualty reports. The Pacific at the search site is nearly 16,000 feet deep, a realm of crushing pressure and eternal darkness where the temperature hovers just above freezing. But in the last decade, the advent of high-resolution multi-beam echo sounders and autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, has turned the impossible search into a high-tech forensic investigation. Modern expeditions, led by groups like Project Recover and various oceanographic institutes, have begun scanning the seafloor corridors north and west of Oahu. What they found wasn't a single graveyard, but a scattered trail of debris that tells a story of desperate, final moments. In 2022, deep-sea scanners picked up a hard return, roughly 150 miles off the coast of Kauai. The sonar imagery revealed a large, 4-engine silhouette resting on a silt-covered plain. It wasn't intact, the tail section was sheared off, and the wings were crumpled, classic signs of a high-speed ditching in heavy swells. Even more haunting are the anomalies found further out, near the Marshall Islands. These are small, localized debris fields, a radial engine here, a twisted propeller blade there. They suggest a catastrophic mid-air disintegration. This lends weight to the interception theory. AB-17 hitting the water at 200 miles per hour leaves a footprint, but AB-17 that explodes in mid-air leaves its debris rain across miles of ocean floor. The most significant find, however, isn't just the metal, it's the condition of the wrecks. In the oxygen-depleted depths of the abyss, the aluminum of the flying fortresses has been eerily preserved. Scanners have captured the outlines of the Shaker fuel tanks still nestled in the bomb bays of at least one wreck, confirming that the plane went down with fuel still on board, likely due to mechanical failure rather than running dry. These modern searches are slowly closing the book on the Ghost Squadron. They prove that these men didn't just vanish into a myth, they fought their aircraft until the very last second. Every ping of the sonar brings us closer to identifying which tail number belongs to which crew. As we map the final resting places of these silver giants, the Ghost Squadron is finally stepping out of the static and into history. They are no longer a wartime cover-up or a sailor's ghost story. They are a memorial in the deep, a testament to the cost of a war that started before they even had a chance to land.